most crucial question I have is, how would you assess the first 4 months of the presidency of Mr. Zelensky? Do you think that his team is dealing quite well domestically and also with Russia or not?
Well, I look at it with kind of a mix of optimism and a little bit of concern. I mean, on the optimistic side, I think he said the right things regarding fighting corruption, regarding reforming the economy, regarding strengthening democratic institutions. And he has a unique opportunity in that for the first time ever in Ukraine's history, since it's regained independence in 1991, he has a prime minister who's supportive, and he has a party in the Bratama that has a majority. So he has the opportunity to do some fairly impressive things. So I think that's hopeful. He's also, I think, on the foreign policy side, been very good about reaching out to try to sustain and strengthen links to countries in the West. We'll see. He has yet to have a face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin or a meeting of the Normandy format. So we still have to see how he handles the entire issues surrounding Russia's conflict with Ukraine. On the concern side, I guess I'd say there are a couple of things. One is, it does seem like they're trying to move very fast in the Rada, passing lots of legislation. And I've heard some concerns that maybe some of that legislation is being passed so quickly that the Rada deputies aren't having the time to sort of fully digest it and perhaps improve it. And then I think still lingering in the background is the question of what is the nature of the relationship between President Zelensky and oligarch Kolomoisky. And that's going to be important because, for example, if there's any assistance by the government to Mr. Kolomoisky in regaining Privatbank, that likely will freeze an IMF program and will raise some real concerns on the part of supporters of Ukraine in the West.
So, and do you think, you touched upon several questions actually I wanted to bring up, but my main issue is, my main question is, do you think there is actually a real possibility, first time, in Ukrainian history, for effective reforms implementation, because we have the youngest government, a lot of people have Western education, and do you think it's really realistic, or there will be some obstacles actually, and there are obstacles, and you brought up, for example, influence of oligarch Kolomoisky as example. Will it preclude them from doing anything?
No, doing real reform is hard work. And Ukraine has made some progress over the past 28 years, but it's been in fits and starts. The question is whether under President Zelensky, Ukraine can now put in that critical mass of reforms that really allows the economy to begin to grow, that strengthen Ukrainian institutions, and that begin to push back against this real problem of corruption. That's the question. I think it's interesting that if you look at the government, there are a lot of young people there, and this is perhaps a cabinet which is the first truly post-Soviet cabinet in Ukraine. But the question also is, they're young people. Do they have the expertise, or will they have advisors who can help them navigate the challenges of running a government? Because running government is not easy. So I look at that and I say, there are reasons for hope, there are reasons for optimism, but also we have to be realistic and say, there are also some concerns there.
So listen, and there are a lot of concerns, lately about the so-called, about the situation in the Donbas region, and especially about the so-called Steinmeier formula, that Ukraine agreed, to kickstart settlement of the conflict. So do you think there are any substantial risks for Ukraine? And don't you think it's taking place according to the Kremlin scenario, or not?
Well, and actually, I'm just about to publish a piece today or tomorrow on this question. It seems to me that we don't yet know enough about how the Steinmeier formula would be implemented. So, for example, last week, President Zelensky said that under the agreement that was negotiated on October 1st, all Russian and Russian proxy forces would have to leave Donbass. Ukraine would then reestablish control over Donbass, and only then would elections be held under Ukrainian law and under observation by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Now, to my mind, if Ukraine can achieve it, that's a victory for Ukraine. But I'm also not sure whether, in fact, at the end of the day, the Russians are prepared to accept that. So that's one question. The second question is there continues, as far as I can tell, in Ukraine to be controversy over this question of greater autonomy for Donbass or this idea of special self-governing status. And again, President Zelensky said that a law will be worked out on what that status means. Until we see that law, I'm not sure you can reach a judgment whether the Steinmeier formula is a good thing or a bad thing. It seems to me that there are certain things that need to stay in Kyiv. Kyiv can have or should have all of the responsibility for setting foreign policy, for setting defense policy, security policy, macroeconomic policy, macro-financial policy. But there are some things, for example, maybe local health and education issues where you can cede power and push power down to the regions or the municipal levels. But until we see those specifics, I don't think I have enough information to judge whether this thing is going to be a good thing or a bad thing for Ukraine. It could go either way.
And I also wanted to, in this regard, also ask you about Crimea. It seems like more and more people keep forgetting about Crimea. Why our government doesn't do sufficient steps, doesn't take sufficient steps to raise awareness of the situation with Crimea and its return. Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't think people either in Ukraine or in the West have forgotten about Crimea. It's just that the focus now really has been on, as it should be, on trying to end the low intensity conflict that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine in the Donbass. I mean, that's where people are dying, every week, with more than 13,000 killed so far. So the way I see it is the proper focus should be, can you end that fighting and then reach a settlement there? Crimea is going to be much more of a long-term issue between Ukraine and Russia. And it's hard for me analytically to see right now how Ukraine musters the leverage to reestablish sovereignty over Crimea. But my policy view is that the United States and the West should continue not to recognize Crimea's illegal annexation by Russia. And we know how to do that. The United States did not recognize the incorporation of the Baltic states to the Soviet Union for nearly 50 years. But I would argue that the Ukrainian government is properly focusing on trying to solve Donbass first. That's the big issue now. And then later on, Crimea.
Yeah, I see. So in your opinion, briefly speaking, what do you think Russia is actually trying to achieve? Is it trying to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty? Is it trying to take over Ukraine gradually? Yeah. What is it trying to do? What kind of strategy do you think it has right now?
Right. Well, it seems to me that Russia is continuing this simmering conflict in Donbass as a way to put pressure on, to destabilize the government in Kyiv, and to make it harder for the Ukrainian government to get on with needed reforms or to develop relations with the West. And that's, I think, the whole point behind what Russia's doing. Now, what does Russia want? I believe ideally Russia would like to see Ukraine give up on its idea of drawing closer to Europe and the Euro-Atlantic community. Russia would like to see Ukraine willingly come back into the Russian orbit. I believe Russian actions, particularly the last 5 years, have made that nearly impossible. So if Russia can't bring Ukraine back into its orbit, it seems like it's trying to do maximum damage to Ukraine.
So basically it uses what some specialists call hybrid warfare techniques to destabilize Ukraine, right? So
well, I think yes, and it's techniques that the Russians can use, at relatively low cost, that are going to make it harder for Ukraine to develop as the successful society that I think most Ukrainians would like to see. It's unfortunate. It's one of the reasons why I believe that the West should be considering further sanctions on Russia to try to change that cost-benefit analysis in the Kremlin. Right now, it appears that the Kremlin believes that the costs of its actions in Donbass are bearable. I'd like to see steps to try to change that calculation and bring the Kremlin to try to reach out to work for a real solution to the Donbass crisis.
So do you think in the last 5 years, actually, Ukraine succeeded combating Russia's, incursion? Or not?
I think, Ukraine today is in a far stronger position than it was back in 2014. The Ukrainian military is much better. Part of that is from Western assistance, but the bulk of that credit is due to the Ukrainian military itself, which I think has developed the capabilities not to be able to drive the Russian proxy forces out of Donbass, but to make it very clear that any further offensive actions by the Russians and their proxy forces would come at significant costs. And so far, I believe that the Russians don't want to bear those costs. So the military situation has somewhat stabilized. Unfortunately, though, it's not a frozen conflict because you still have shooting going across the line of contact on a weekly basis. The Ukrainian army continues to suffer casualties. So we haven't yet settled things, but I would look at it and say the military situation for Ukraine today is much better than it was back in 2014.
So there is some hope, right? Also for Ukraine, maybe to gradually improve this its approach. Yeah. Okay. And
there's some hope, but I guess I would say I don't see a military solution for Ukraine to this conflict. Ukraine is not going to be able to match the resources of the Russian military, and certainly when I've been in Ukraine, Ukrainians understand that they can't push the Russian out military. At the end of the day, there's going to have to be some kind of a political solution. But I do believe the Russian military today is better positioned to resist any further Russian incursions.
But it's can you hear me? Yeah. So, but it still uses asymmetrical means, right? It tries to use this informational propaganda, right?
Russia's using misinformation, asymmetrical means. It's in Ukraine, and it's doing that, I believe, also in more broadly in Europe and against the West. It's a new type of conflict that we all have to get used to.
And I also wanted to ask you, and what do you think about the recently released transcript? Do you think between Zelensky and Trump, do you think it actually damaged Zelensky's reputation? Because a lot of people say it probably damaged in the West, where it didn't have any adverse impact on Ukraine.
I'm not sure it damaged Zelensky's image in the West. I mean, the phone call showed that President Zelensky was trying to flatter President Trump. My guess is his advisors told him to do that. I wrote an article a month and a half ago where I said, yes, President Zelensky should try to flatter President Trump. President Trump responds well to that. And my guess is if you looked at a number of other phone calls between President Trump and foreign leaders, you would see foreign leaders also trying to flatter the president in the same way. The concern I have, though, now is, if you look at that July 25 phone conversation, it was clear President Trump was not doing U.S. business. He was not trying to promote U.S. national interests. He was focused on his own personal interest in trying to discredit his potential Democratic rival in 2020. And that, to my mind, creates a very difficult situation for Ukraine, or a risky situation. Ukraine should not want to become a political football in America's domestic politics or in the 2020 American election, because Ukraine, since it regained independence in 1991, has enjoyed strong, broad, bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans alike. And that's an asset for Ukraine, and that's good for Ukraine. But if Ukraine becomes a political football, there's a danger that you could disrupt that bipartisan support, and that would be risky for Ukraine. So I think President Zelensky needs to be very careful about how he proceeds in the relationship with the United States and how he responds to these requests from the White House, from the president, for investigations into long debunked stories about Vice President Biden. Because if he does that, he'll be intruding into American politics in a way that I think will provoke a negative reaction against Ukraine. I have time for about one more question.
Say it again, sorry?
I have time for about one more question.
Okay, sorry, excuse me. Yeah. So, and do you see any other risks to Ukrainian statehood right now? And are there any of them? Do you see right now?
No, I actually think that Ukrainian statehood is well established. Certainly there is the conflict in Donbass. There is Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. But Ukraine, I believe, is a far stronger state than it was in the 90s. There are opportunities for Ukraine that were difficult to see 20 years ago. And perhaps most importantly, it seems to me that there's a sense of Ukrainian national identity that is much stronger and much deeper than was the case 20 or even 10 years ago. And a lot of that is thanks to Vladimir Putin. I believe Russia's aggression of the past 4.5 years has really helped forge a strong national identity in Ukraine that I think is even fairly deeply held in the eastern parts of Ukraine. And that kind of drive, plus the pro-European sentiment, the desire to become a normal European country that we saw on the streets during the Maidan Revolution, I think that can drive Ukraine to a more positive future, one in which it becomes, I hope, a normal European state.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And,
okay.
Yeah.
And if you post this, please send me a link, okay?
Certainly. Yeah.
Thank
you
you
so much. Have a good
You're
day.
welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.